everyone. Welcome to the 2020 CTNS Family Fellowship Research Conference. This fellowship program really embodies the full spectrum of our program, whose mission is to promote the creative interaction between theology and science, and research, teaching, and public service. This is the research component. Adam was part of a teaching event 2 days ago. And of course, he did a public lecture Thursday evening. So it's a delight to see you all here. I hope you have your schedule so you can kind of follow along with the agenda. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce Adam Pryor, is this year's Family Fellow. Adam is Associate Professor of Religion and Dean of Academic Affairs for Student Success at Bethany College. His research is focused on issues in religion and science, phenomenology, queer studies, and the work of Paul Tillich. He is the author or editor of a number of books, the most recent being Living with Tiny Aliens, The Image of God for the Anthropocene. One of them attacked me, as you can see. Adam entered the GTU in 2008 with an undergraduate summa cum laude in theology and philosophy, a minor in sacred music, and an MDiv at Princeton Seminary. At the GTU, he took 2 graduate UC Berkeley courses with anthropologist Terry Deegan, and a course by UCB paleoanthropologist Margaret Conklin. In 2009, he was my teaching assistant for the course he sat in on Thursday, Introduction to Christian Theology and Science. Adam then received a coveted Newhall grant from the GTU to work with me in creating a body of introductory materials in theology and science, which I've used since then in the course. So thank you again, Adam. In his special comps, Adam focused on the implications for biosemiotics for our understanding of the Imago Dei. In his dissertation completed in 2012, which is 4 years since he entered, Adam focused on theological discourse about the living God, where he theologically reimagined the religious symbol of the living God by taking seriously scientific research on the origin and emergence of life from non-life 3.85 billion years ago. After joining the faculty at Bethany College in 2013, Adam produced an astonishing stream of excellent publications and conference presentations that have developed and extended this research in a variety of important ways. For example, Adam published his dissertation in a groundbreaking book, The God Who Lives, examining the emergence of life and the doctrine of God, published in 2014. CTNS published a remarkable essay, Which Abogen, Whose Incompleteness, considering the ontological conditions of teleodynamics as strong emergence in our journal Theology and Science, as well as his review of our book Astrobiology, thanks to Ted, as chief editor in Theology and Science. Last year, Adam was a resident member of the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton for their investigation of both the societal implications of astrobiology, sponsored by NASA and the John Temple Foundation. On a personal note, I richly enjoy Adam. He is a wonderful, thoughtful, and gracious dialogue partner. He is steeped in the Christian tradition in his fully ecumenical context, and he brings to this a knowledge and experience of Christian life rare for its depth and integrity. It is always a pleasure to work with him, to experience his enthusiasm, humor, and generous spirit. Friends, we're in for a real treat this afternoon as we hear Adam's presentation of how, what if we're not alone, considering the significance of non-intelligent life for constructive Christian theology. Please join me in welcoming Adam Pryor.
Bob's introductions are too kind. He leaves you speechless before you are supposed to speak. I am greatly honored really thrilled to be in Berkeley. It is wonderful to be here, to get a chance to give a lecture that for so many years I got to sit and hear, to appreciate, and on a personal note, the Russell Conference is an entity unto itself in terms of the way scholars get to present their work and then have deep and rich interaction in a way that doesn't happen a lot in the academy anymore. So I'm humbled, a little frightened by what the respondents will say, and ready and hopeful that you will find at least a little bit of this persuasive. Generally, the argument that I end up putting forward is framed more in terms of philosophy of religion instead of theology. So there are a few pieces here that are shifting around, but part of what I'm presenting today is the research that I've been doing that'll be forthcoming in May with Oregon University Press. And I love this photo that's the background of the presentation. It came from the Cassini mission, 2013, right? And my favorite part of it, right, is that it is a picture of Earth, right? Which is not usually how we talk about it, right? But there we are. Right? So when we back out to this frame of reference, part of what I have been asking in my research for really the past 10 years has been, when you back out to this frame of reference, what does this do to different doctrines within the Christian tradition? How do you have to rethink them when the typical modes of anthropocentrism are let go or decentered? Today, I want to focus specifically on astrobiology as the sort of scientific discipline to have communication with. Talk a little bit about where philosophy might help build a bit of a bridge towards thinking about the relationship between astrobiology and theology, and then jump into three doctrinal symbols: the image of God, sin, and vocation. So, when I think about astrobiology, and as someone who was not originally trained as a scientist, what always struck me was just how vast space really is. And that we don't really think about that all that much. One way of framing just how vast space really is to talk about it in terms of grains of sand. So some astrophysicists will estimate that for every grain of sand that you find on a beach, there are 1,000 stars. These numbers are just hard to imagine and put our heads around. Essentially, what you end up finding is that the universe is huge. Another way of framing this, right, is to say, with Doug Adams, space is big, really big. You just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is. I mean, you may think it's a long way down the road to the chemist, but that's just peanuts to space. In a certain sense, gets to the same idea, to try and hold on to this notion of vastness amidst a wide range of possible inquiries that we might ask in its wake. So, I was taken by this vastness, and when I started working on this topic, that chemist from down the street, actually a chemistry professor who I work with, said, I wrote this quote down, and I put it on my door every day when I was writing about these topics to remind myself why it is that I can't go too far off in science fiction. Great, you're going to study the science where they're still looking for the object they want to study. And at the time, I didn't necessarily realize that that was a strong insult, because I studied theology, so demonstrating the object of my field exists is a little tricky. But then I caught on to what was happening. And it was a really, I think, important objection to raise. So often we talk about astrobiology in terms of this idea that it's just waiting for us to discover aliens. And once we do that, then astrobiology will really get going. But the astrobiologists who I have interacted with, who I talk with, who I've worked with on various projects, take a very different view to this. And I think it's important. So I wanted us to talk about some of the things that astrobiologists actually study, right? And it turns out none of them are actually aliens, which is, I think, helpful, right? So the first one, right, is one that you may have heard of, right? Kepler 452b, right? This was a news release that came out with its discovery, right? Kepler 452b got announced in 2015 as part of the Kepler mission. It is orbiting a G2 type star that is just like ours. Right? Their star is about 10% bigger, but it still falls in what we call the habitable zone, right? And the parallels just kept coming, right? 365 days in a year here, 385 days in a year for Kepler 452b, 1.6 times the size of Earth, roughly the same size. When it was announced, when they were doing these massive descriptions of it, Dr. Daniel Brown at Nottingham Trent University said, "This is so fascinating because Kepler 452b receives the same kind of spectrum and intensity of light as we do on Earth. This means plants from our planet could grow there. If it were rocky and it had an atmosphere, you could even get a healthy tan, like here on holiday." Now, Kepler 452b grabbed a lot of attention, but when I checked this morning, there were 4,135 confirmed exoplanets. In the wake of that, one that is maybe getting more attention now is this one, Proxima b. Okay? Proxima b has gotten attention after 2016. It orbits the star that's circled here, and it will be the closest exoplanet that we will ever find. It circles its star, a red dwarf, much cooler than our sun, every 11.2 days. It is 4.22 light years away from Earth. Now, if you would like to sort of imagine what that means, right, it would take about 54,000 years to reach Proxima b with the speed of current unmanned probes. So close is a generous description of what's happening here. But the announcements about Proxima b also often came out with these descriptions of the Breakthrough Starshot Initiative, which I will describe for you in a sentence. Build a big sail, build a big laser, make a really tiny little probe, and shoot the big laser at the sail. And when you do that, it will zip off much, much faster at undetermined but arguable various percentages of the speed of light. And the idea was that you could get information from Proxima b with a flyby sent back to the Earth over the course of about 25 years. 54,000 to 25 sounds pretty good. By the by, some big problems here, like when you shoot something that fast, is it going to hold together? Will it run into something in between? Big question. Also, we don't have a laser that big, just saying. So things to keep in mind when you look at these press releases that come out, right? But astrobiology is not just about exoplanets, right? It probably gets the most news. This one is my favorite. This is Enceladus, an icy moon of Saturn. What I love about Enceladus is that it's not so huge. It's about the size of 5 states: Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas. And you might expect it to just be a cold, dead rock. And instead, the gravitational tensions of Enceladus going around Saturn along with its interaction with another moon creates friction in the middle of the planet such that now the thought is that there is actually a subsurface ocean underneath all of that ice. And that subsurface ocean heats up occasionally and spurts out as geysers at these, you can sort of see them here, these lighter blue fractures. Sometimes they get called tiger stripes along Enceladus. It made the news more recently because the Cassini mission, which took that nice image of Saturn, was rerouted so that it kept flying by Enceladus in the hope that its probe, it had basically I described it in a sort of crass way, an arm with a cup on it, trying to fly through this geyser in order to sample what was in it, and found significant numbers of organic compounds. Organic compounds that we would think might be similar to or present like black smokers here on Earth. There was a direct parallel. Part of what I hope that you're hearing is that the public news announcements about astrobiology stress parallels to this place. Almost always. Why is it significant? Because it's like us. Now, that's great on the one hand. But on the other hand, there are some problems when what you're doing is stressing similarity. So, this is the news piece that I also put next to that quote that I had when I started. Emphasizing that they only wanted to hear announcements about actual cool stuff in space, millions of impatient Americans flat out commanded Monday that NASA stop holding all press conferences until they discover some little alien guys. Nobody even cares there's some water on Mars. We have water on Earth, so they shouldn't even bother having a stupid press conference unless there's proof of alien guys with a bunch of eyes or tentacles or something, said Fort Wayne, Indiana Resident Kyle Schultz. Gotta love the onion. It will always help keep things in perspective for you, right? And my personal favorite, right? And none of that microscopic organismic crap. It should be real alien dudes with way more arms than humans and can talk using their minds instead of their mouths. Every time I have talked to students, particularly undergraduate students, about what it is that I do, this is the expectation, not pretty pictures of stars and planets, which has a lot to do with this question of similarity. So often when we talk about astrobiology, when we talk about the alien life that's being searched for, what we actually have in mind are aliens like us. We jump immediately to extraterrestrial intelligence. A lot of my work has been about pulling back that frame, looking at, thinking about the ways in which astrobiology is doing something different. What it's really doing are looking for indirect signs, biosignatures, the ways in which life might emerge. I often question if that is really enough to keep the public's attention. It won't be our focus here, but I think it's a question worth raising in terms of how this gets perceived. When we look at the actual sort of scientific structures of what is going on in astrobiology, I tend to turn towards NASA's astrobiology strategy document, which actually has 6 questions, but I've kind of condensed them into 3 that I think get at the big issues. When you are doing astrobiology, you want to avoid the abiotic. So, think of this as a methodological point. You don't want to falsely tell the public that there's something alive in another place that we've discovered and then realize there's an abiotic explanation for how that biosignature ended up there. We made that mistake once with a Martian meteorite, ALH 840001. 1995, Bill Clinton got up and held a press conference about how we had discovered alien life. Oops. We haven't, just FYI. So, right, this one's a more methodological piece. These 2, though, are, I think, really important because I think they shape what it is that astrobiology is really doing. Astrobiology is interested in understanding living systems and conceptualizing the habitable environments in which those living systems might occur. So Carl Pilcher, who was the director of the NASA's Astrobiology Institute, described the purpose of astrobiology this way to me: a quest to understand the potential of the universe to harbor life beyond Earth. It was a really clear and simple explanation that also doesn't use the word alien. A quest to understand the potential of the universe to harbor life beyond Earth. I've bolded these 3 words, potential, harbor, and life, because I think they get to the significance that we're describing in these 2 pieces here. What are the habitats in which living systems might emerge? Not just here on this planet, but can we elaborate conditions in which that would occur anywhere across the vastness of those 1,000 stars per grain of sand? If we want to put that into technical language, I use these 2 pieces. The top one is about life, living systems. The bottom one is about conceptualizing habitability. So, what are astrobiologists looking for? A widespread, non-equilibrium system driven by a persistent geophysical or geochemical energy gradient. It's a fancy way of saying we are looking for free energy that may not necessarily come specifically from a star. Okay? These 4 pieces, though, relate to the question of habitability. when we think about habitability, I think most of us think about this nifty beaver and its dam, a very sort of complex notion of habitability. When astrobiologists are talking about habitability, they're talking about the minimum conditions that need to pertain such that that living system will get going. There are at least 3 pieces that factor into almost every description you will read about habitability in astrobiology. What is the liquid solvent around which these chemical actions will take place? What's the corresponding chemistry to the liquid solvent? Because not all chemistries work the same way in different solvents. And what's the metabolic energy source that's going to be available? Eventually, if you're going to have some sort of, I call them teeny tiny aliens, that are going to emerge, they're going to need some sort of energy source on which their metabolism is going to run. All of this also has to take place with a consideration for breadth. How much solvent do you need? How much of the basic chemical structures that are going to be used need to be present? And how much energy source needs to be there? Right? So these 3 are tightly related, and this becomes a supervening criteria. Now, if this is what astrobiology is doing, when we get to the question and answer period, if we want to talk more about very specific examples, I will happily do that. I didn't want to sort of dive too deep into that right out of the game. My suspicion as a theologian, and somebody who works more with philosophy of religion, is that there is a shift in the language game taking place that's not being put out into the general public real well. And that shift in the language game, in my opinion, also explains part of why we tend to market these ideas in terms of similarity. Because if we played the shift in the language game, it would be really difficult for people to follow. But we, in this room, can certainly follow. So we don't have to play the game as it's usually played. So astrobiology is interested in where and how whole generations and populations of microbial living things might come into existence in the universe and proliferate into all sorts of complexities. We have to keep that idea in the back of our minds, right? When we do that, there are 3 features that I want to talk about. The first one is a helpful, I think it's a helpful, philosophical concept called interaction. Oops, sorry. I forgot that I had hidden some text here, right? Why do we need to keep those things in mind? Because, and I think this is a big piece of what astrobiology is doing, living systems in habitable conditions are fundamentally linked. You don't have a living system develop without a suitable understanding of its habitable conditions. Now, other branches of biology clearly have recognized this for a long time. We could choose lots of other folks by which to say, well, this is important. What I think astrobiology does is make it a foundational concept. Good biology cannot be pursued without this as a consideration. I think that's part of what astrobiology is doing. If I want to put a nice neat bow on that, what I would argue is that I think astrobiology is trying to make biology into a first principles science instead of a descriptive science. Now, if you do that and you link living systems and habitability, we have a little chicken and an egg problem. So, as I look through my telescope at Saturn, because clearly Saturn is the best planet, everybody likes the rays. So as I look through the telescope at Saturn, right, I have this experience of Saturn. And we would generally talk about there being me and the telescope and Saturn as 3 distinct objects. The notion of interaction wants to say those are not 3 distinct objects. Instead, what we would call a primary ontological unit, which is a fancy way of saying the furniture of the stuff that's in the universe that we should care about, is all 3 of those linked together. And that at a different point, that primary ontological unit might shift. They're not static. Now, for anybody sort of keeping score with the philosophy and religion side of this in the room, that should be highly problematic. Not usually how we talk about ontology in any sort of standard framework. However, I think what astrobiology is pointing to by linking, in an effort to make this first principle argument, by linking living systems and habitability, they are actually saying that whole system is a better way of doing ontology than breaking apart into its component pieces, assuming component pieces are more component. Oops, sorry. This is the phrase that gets bantered around a lot in that tradition of work, sometimes called new materialism, sometimes called agential realism. Relata, the pieces, do not pre-exist relations, the wholeness of the experience. Okay? So, if we take astrobiology as an interactive discipline, then philosophically it's forcing us to ask an interesting question. What does the term life pertain to? We would generally say it pertains to those little individual organisms. But under this framework, life better pertains to the entirety of the system. So, we would talk about life as a planetary or a statistical quality of certain phenomena, not as a descriptor of organisms. This is the part that's sort of hard to get our head around. In my little picture here, right, with my bacteria, my trees, I had originally planned to put an ant there, but I liked that bug-looking creature better. Well, my daughter did. And this man that will probably be me in 3 years walking around with a cane, right? We would generally describe each of those individual pieces, those individual organisms, as living. On an astrobiological framework, we want to say that it is the planetary system that is alive. That what we would draw a distinction between are living planets and non-living planets. Now, a lot of this has to do with this question about frames of reference and size, which I was trying to find, where is it that scientists got excited about this idea? I was trying to track it down, and I think I found it. I think I did. We're going to see if this is going to play or not. Oh, it did.
Near the lakeside in Chicago was the start of a lazy afternoon, early one October. We begin with a scene 1 meter wide, which we view from just 1 meter away. Now every 10 seconds we will look from 10 times farther away, and our field of view will be 10 times wider. This square is 10 meters wide, and in 10 seconds the next square will be 10 times as wide. Our picture will center on the picnickers, even after they've been lost to sight. 100 meters wide. The distance a man can run in 10 seconds. Cars crowd the highway. Powerboats lie at their docks. The colorful bleachers are Soldiers Field. This square is 1 kilometer wide, 1,000 meters. The distance a racing car can travel in 10 seconds. We see the great city on the lake shore. 10 to the 4th meters, 10 kilometers. The distance a supersonic airplane can travel in 10 seconds. We see first the rounded end of Lake Michigan, then the whole Great Lake, 10 to the 5th meters. The distance an orbiting satellite covers in 10 seconds. Long parades of clouds, the day's weather in the Middle West. 10 to the 6th, a 1 with 6 zeros, 1 million meters. Soon the Earth will show as a solid sphere. We are able to see the whole Earth now, just over a minute along the journey. The Earth diminishes into the distance, but those background stars are so much farther away that they do not yet appear to move.
Eventually go not only out, but also into the human bodies of the individuals who are there, right? It was meant as a sort of teaching exercise. I think I can do this, but I'll figure out how to get out of this here in a second. part of what you end up seeing here, right, is an idea that comes from a book written in 1957 by Keyes Becky called Cosmic View. And as far as I can tell, this playing with the issue of perspective, particularly in philosophical scientific discourse about philosophy of science, traces back to this idea. Folks are implicitly referencing this little film that was showed to elementary school kids without ever actually acknowledging it often. One, who I think does this in great fashion, is David Grinspoon, a planetary scientist, right? So here's his description, which for the life of me, I think should always cite Keyes Becky. Right? The planetary perspective allows us to step away from the noise of the immediate present, to see ourselves from a distance in time lapse. When we do so, what we see is not just a problem facing our civilization, but an entirely new evolutionary stage in the development of life. In seeing ourselves as a geological process, we also see planets entering a phase where cognitive processes are becoming a major agent of global change. Earth's biosphere gave birth to these thoughts, which are now in turn feeding back and reshaping its changing planetary cycles. A planet with brains, fancy that. It's a variation of this very short film. There's something fundamentally interesting about the way in which perspective shapes the way we want to describe these phenomena. Now, my interest, right, and I told you, is going to be to get us to thinking about the image of God, which means at some point we have to talk about human beings. Not my favorite subject, I prefer to just stick with the tiny aliens, but we'll get there, right? So, what I was starting to take away from thinking about how it is that you would reframe this in terms of the Imago Dei was to put together two fundamental statements. Human being is a form of living being. That one seems pretty uncomplicated. Astrobiologically, living being must be described in terms of the deep kind of planetary interactions. That one is maybe not quite so uncomplicated, right? But it's the argument that we have been driving at so far. Living being has to be understood in conjunction with the habitable environments which it has some sort of effect on. What I think is really well done is that David Grinspoon, who I cited here just a second ago, has suggested that perhaps the significance of astrobiology is in thinking about a new epoch that is emerging. So what he does is correlate what would be technically called forms of catastrophic change in the history of the planet with the various eons of geological history. So, the Hadean is tied with the very formation of the Earth. The Archean gets tied with the emergence of life. The Proterozoic tied with the occurrence of a biosphere. Think about the great oxygenation event. The Phanerozoic with the development of multicellular life. And pointing us towards what could be the significance of human beings, a distinct piece of this evolutionary schema. He says we are entering a new eon, the Sapiozoic, that is shaped by human consciousness. Now, I like David's work, but I really just don't agree with him about this consciousness piece. I don't think that's what's actually going on. Instead, I think we need a better description that fits, right? I think this is a false, if you want the sort of technical term, right, I think he's making a false syllogism, right, by inputting a concept that's not originally part of the structure of the argument itself. A better argument on the framework that he set out, I think, would be to say the Sapiozoic eon would be one in which something added to existing biogeochemical cycles such that a catastrophic event did not result in massive extinctions. Be a more technical definition, doesn't sell itself as well as consciousness or, planets with brains, but I would argue a better representation of the argument that he's actually put forward. So, I took this idea to suggest that if astrobiologists are suggesting, not all of them, but there are a group of astrobiologists that are suggesting this is a way of interpreting what it means to be human, well, religious folks, particularly Christian theologians, certainly have a stake in the claim about trying to figure out what it means to talk about meaningful human being. I put this at the outset because all of these little circles, I promise they're not quite so full as some of the others, all of these little circles are really getting at one fundamental point that I want to drive at. I think the significance of astrobiology, particularly for the Imago Dei, is to talk about how we are moving from a living planet to an artful planet. From a living planet to an artful planet. Now, for theologians, this is being framed by a very specific and one could argue, too specific set of methods, right? So I would argue the task of contemporary theology is to interpret symbols. So in this case, I'm going to look at the Imago Dei, sin, and vocation in light of a given context of engagement for that interpretation, which is what astrobiology is doing in the argument. Specifically, the idea that living systems may not be separated from habitable conditions as an interactive phenomenon that's primary. And this provides a hermeneutical framework for the ways in which a symbol can meaningfully inspire ways of being in the world and the formation of values in a given community. What I think is really important about astrobiology in this context of engagement, right, is that it makes sure theology is a public discourse. What I mean by that, in this case, is going to be somewhat more specific. These doctrinal symbols have to reach out, not reach in. These are not about formulating apologetic arguments for what is proper Christianity. These are about forming statements about meaningful symbols that then encourage engagement with other folks who may not accept those symbols as meaningful. We'll get to why that maybe matters here in a second. So, astrobiology is pushing that because of this distinctive context and engagement. I'm using these four features of it when I make my move to a theological argument. Interaction and integration are fundamental to the ways in which astrobiology gets described by astrobiologists. Life is understood as a living system, not as a property of individual small, tiny organisms. The habitable environment is immensely important and cannot be separated from the description of the living system. And that habitable environment is often conceived in two senses. This depends on which sort of astrobiological phenomena you're looking at. One is instantaneous, and the other is planetary. So the astrobiologist looking at all of those exoplanets is interested in life as a planetary phenomena and issues of planetary habitability. The scientist who's working on those icy moons like Enceladus, or maybe potentially even Titan or a few others, is looking at instantaneous habitability. Habitability in a more specific location that probably does not pertain across the entirety of the astronomical system or body in question. Now, when we talk about the image of God, right, this is maybe not what initially comes to mind. We tend to think of those nice, neat stories in Genesis. This is Harmonious Bosch, just because I didn't want you to get too high on yourselves about being happy about Genesis and all of the nice fancy things before the fall. Harmonious Bosch reminds us that's all part of one long story to consider. But we tend, I think, to think about only one story, that story from Genesis. And what I would argue is part of what we have to do theologically to make this work is think about the Imago Dei in terms of its relationship to cosmogony and the significance of cosmogony across the Hebrew Bible. Now, I won't go really deeply into that argument in terms of how it is that are constructed, but I'll give you the sort of Cliff Notes version. I think what happens when you look at cosmogonies across the Hebrew Bible is that you find that meaning is always tied up with existence. There is not a concern for the occurrence of bare existence. Existence is inherently meaningful in various stories of cosmology from the Hebrew Bible, cosmology, right? There's a second piece here that I think is really significant when we talk about the image of God, which is that we usually talk about it as a reflection. And I think that's the wrong metaphor optically. Instead, I would like to talk about the image of God as a refraction, right? So instead of the power of God's creation bouncing off of us, my suggestion is to say it's probably a better way of interpreting this idea of image to say that the power of God works through us, and the presence of human beings is a distinct phenomenon. Bend that power in a way that would not otherwise make that power available to creation. In the same way that a prism slows light down, bends that light such that you see rainbows appear out of white light. Something new appears that was already there, but not otherwise possible. Okay? So, if we take those two pieces as part of what was historically in the tradition, or slight emendation of the tradition of the Imago, now I want to look at what happens when you put this in an astrobiological framework. So the first piece is to say, it has to be a shared phenomenon. You or I, as individual organisms, don't matter to the Imago Dei. Us, we do. Right? This is part of that living system piece. Right? Second is that we can think about this in terms of instantaneous habitability. All of those nice things that you do are not irrelevant. Instantaneous habitability matters. All of the ways that we usually describe ecological ethics and eco-theology still matter as instances of instantaneous habitability in this world. But they also have to be framed in terms of a sense of planetary habitability. And that means thinking about how it is that human being introduces something that goes beyond what we typically mean by living system in that definition from astrobiology. So, in his line, what I would suggest is that to be the image of God describes not a single species or genus, but a new state in the ordering and meaningful existence of all creation. I think there are some advantages to this definition of the Imago Dei, which we'll come back to maybe right at the very end, but I want to keep moving in enough to make sure that I keep us on time. I'll do my best. Right? Next, I wanted to look to vocation. And in particular, since I'm a Lutheran theologian, I work at a Lutheran college, one can't talk about vocation without going and looking at Luther. So I went to Luther and I said, well, what'd you say, buddy? And really, I thought there were these two sort of interesting pieces. One is that your vocation furthers God's love in creation. There are a couple of different words that you can use for this in German or Latin, but really what Luther is getting at is saying every occupation that you have in a community is your vocation insofar as you do this act of using it to further God's love. So you have a vocation, in my case, as a father. I have a vocation as a professor. I have a vocation as the advisor of a fraternity on campus. These are all vocations. They are not equally important vocations. Some are vocations that I hope within the next year or so will no longer be mine. You may decide which one of those three that is. But they're not static. Vocations change over time. We almost always have more than one in the way that Luther frames this. And he also talks about it in this interesting way of saying that we live toward death. And I think this is a really interesting piece that sometimes gets overlooked in Luther's notion of vocation. Luther means something like this. This world is not heaven. Surprise, surprise. It turns out. And so what we are doing when we are living out our vocation is that we are living into or living towards death. We're living towards a particular understanding of the finitude in which we find ourselves, such that we alleviate the suffering of others. Now, all of Luther's work here is centered on the individual as the location of where this vocation occurs. So in an astrobiological framework, what I'm suggesting is we start to reframe these concepts, right? So to be the Imago Dei, in a planetary sense, is to open new meaningful modes of interaction and artfulness between current living systems and habitable environments. It's this transition from living to artful that I would characterize as a vocation of the entirety of the human species, if we're doing this. And if we want to keep talking with our astrobiologist friends, what I would say is that we can talk about that vocation in a very specific sense. It is a techno-biogeochemical system. We move from biogeochemical systems, primarily on living planets, to techno-biogeochemical systems on these artful planets. Now, wherever there is vocation, there is also sin, where we have failed to live into said vocation, right? So, traditionally, sin was talked about as separation from God. In the language that I've been setting up here in terms of its relationship to astrobiology, I think the failing of vocation is a better way to describe that. When we talk about sin in a sort of more traditional theological framework, we can also talk about the quality of sin in terms of its hiddenness, the hiddenness of structural evils. This is a fancy way of saying that the things that we do, the powers that we have, can be used for good or for ill. And too often, we blame the very existence of those powers for them moving towards an ill. The goodness of the power hides or obscures the illness that results. I would compare this to that technological ambiguity. The techno of the techno-biogeochemical cycle is not always helpful. This is probably the point where I'm cautioning various folks who would like to do things like climate engineering, right? Have a conversation there. Last but not least, right? When we talk about sin, we often talk about naturalized hegemonic orientations. That's not fair. I talk about naturalized hegemonic orientations, and some folks also do. What I mean by naturalized hegemonic orientations is that as these structural evils get hidden, they become seen as irremovable. They become seen as part of what existence is meant and always will be. And in terms of techno-biogeochemical cycles, I suggest those are positive feedback systems. Positive feedback systems are systems that don't have a check on them. They have a runaway effect. You can think about using up chemical agents in various reactions. Right? Once you run out, they're done, they're over. We don't like positive runaway feedback if we also like sustainability. This is a point that I emphasize to students all of the time, and they don't ever quite seem to get it because they're like, positive's good, right? I'm like, no, positive is really, really, really bad in this particular context. Okay? Now, I think the result of this is that you can start putting these three ideas together. So, to be the Imago Dei is to be a planetary system that weathers catastrophic change without the cycle of mass extinction. There's the Imago Dei piece. Events typical of the Phanerozoic eon, mass extinctions are events typical of the Phanerozoic eon, by introducing techno-biogeochemical cycles that promote the flourishing of the rest of creation, there's your vocation piece, by resisting the development of runaway positive feedback systems. It's the sin piece. This would be a way of taking three traditional doctrinal symbols and framing them in terms of a social significance that I think holds up against the scientific work that's being done in astrobiology now. So, who cares? I'll give you a hint. This is my pitch for the book. It's the only pitch I promise I'll make for the book. That is about page 130. And it goes on to page 200. Which is to say, I recognize that I don't think worshiping communities are suddenly going to start talking about techno-biogeochemical cycles in their prayers for the people. Okay? Doesn't have a good ring to it. But I do like this way of framing what's going on for three reasons, right? The first is that it makes a public theological argument. If I want to live into being the Imago Dei, I can't just do that with my church friends. I have to get outside of the community of which I am a part in order to convince others of the importance of this idea. In an increasingly polarized society, if we could just get that far, I'd be thrilled. Okay? Number two is that I think it goes beyond the human. This is a definition of the Imago Dei that could work for a human or a post-human future, or it could also work for another species or another system on a different living planet. There's no reason to limit the idea of the Imago Dei to here. I think it also puts us beyond the human in an interesting way when we talk about where it is that humans live. Astrobiology ties human being to, or ties living being to the particularity of its habitable environment. If human beings start to colonize various places in space, I would argue they start to become a different vision of the Imago Dei, situated in the context of their new habitable environment. Hopefully would have some interesting consequences, right? Last but not least is that this goes beyond the earth. This is a way of making a constructive theological argument that should be in principle effective anywhere that you would have life start to emerge in the cosmos. if it works, what you would expect to be able to see is that from biogeochemical systems developing on various planets, technobiogeochemical systems would then follow suit. Now, not super quickly, right? I mean, those descriptions of the various eons of the Earth last millions and millions and millions of years. So it's not a fast argument, and possibly not a provable argument, but an in-principle argument that you should be able to apply a theological concept in order to guide how it is that you would frame research descriptions in astrobiology.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Sorry.
Me neither, I didn't. So, I am really looking forward to how it is that folks would like to respond to this and or press on different pieces of it. Hopefully there's at least something that everybody can take a little bit of a whack at. And I thank you for listening and being so generous to me.